So last week we considered the mythogenic engagement, the way the Bible became a cultural storehouse of mythology from which poets drew to uh, create imagery and their own expressions. This lecture, I want to talk about the typological engagement with the Bible, which also inspired a lot of poetry, not just by allusions, but through the very intellectual engagement with the subjects at hand. Dickinson is going to be our example here, as well as Wilfred Owen towards the end. I'm going to say I'm joined here today with the live community, as I always am on these lectures. So if anyone on YouTube is watching this and enjoying any content since 2024, it's all because of the online community here who attend these lectures and private seminar discussions. Their support has allowed me to take the public humanities work that I do here more seriously and to make some of this content available to you. So thank you all who are gathered here live and for being united helpers, to borrow a phrase from Wordsworth, or joint laborers in the work. And to those on YouTube, thanks for supporting the channel with views. I'm talking a little bit today about the story of Abraham and Isaac. It has the threat of violence in it. We'll see a painting with the threat of violence in it. So I'm just saying that since we have often younger viewers, or just so people are aware, but otherwise nothing too graphic. I want to begin by talking about the division of the Bible. The Christian Bible is divided into two testaments, the Old Testament and the New. The Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible. The New Testament are those specifically Christian scriptures. So typology is a method of reading. It interprets things in the Old Testament as prefigurations of things in the New Testament. So the testaments are talking back and forth to each other. The Old Testament contains types. And this is where we get the word typology, the study of types. And the New Testament contains their fulfillments, what are called the antitypes. This is not, of course, how the Jewish readers, the Hebrew readers read their own scriptures. This is a specifically Christian interpretation of Hebrew scriptures in dialogue with the New. So for poets, typology became a creative tool for exploring relationships in nature with the written word and also with the Bible. And the practice of reading typologically has changed over time. And I'm going to trace some of those changes. And in a way, it's become secularized. I don't like the word secularism the way it's described in this context. I think it's reinvented. So they take this very biblical understanding of reading and then they reapply it to different contexts. Doesn't mean it's necessarily less spiritual, but it's definitely less religious. So I want to trace those transformations by giving you a template for identifying typological engagement in poetry. So here's the plan for the lecture. Number one, we're going to look at type. We're going to give you some examples of types in the Old Testament that prefigure a fulfillment in the New Testament. And we're going to be reading, and I'm going to be using, rather, the story of Abraham and Isaac as a case study of this. Secondly, we're going to look at how Christians, especially in England around the 16th, 17th centuries, began to apply a typological look at nature and how things in nature were related to Christ in the same way that they were reading things in the Old Testament as related to Christ. Then thirdly, I'm going to look at how natural objects in nature become a symbol for spiritual truths more broadly, not necessarily related to Christ or Christianity at all. And then we're going to look at how the type is something that is secularized and reappropriated in different contexts. And then finally, we're going to look at how the biblical type can be applied to a secular or contemporary circumstance. And I believe this is what we saw in our readings with Wilfred Owen. So, a type is, again, a specifically historical thing. It is one historical thing in the Old Testament that looks to something in the New Testament. Usually it's Christ in the New Testament. The fulfillment is called the antitype. This strategy frames historical and scriptural occurrences as really interconnected within this whole divine temporal narrative. And so it moves across time and speaks back and forth. And so you can imagine the type as a hinge between the two testaments that moves and oscillates like this. Not oscillates, but bends. Uh, and this is part of the dialogue. So the most famous example of a type, let me explain this before I get to that slide, is Adam as the type of Christ. So we saw last week Adam in the garden, Adam and Eve. This is how that works according to Paul's New Testament letter to the Romans. So the New Testament writers are actually applying this method to the Old Testament, and that's how we're getting this. So here's what Paul says in his letter to the Romans. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, that would be Adam, and death through sin entered the world, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him, Christ, who was to come. This is Paul reading the Jewish scriptures in light of Christ. For if by one man's offense, Adam, if by his offense death reigned through one, much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one Jesus Christ. So there's the antitype, Jesus, with the type Adam. Therefore, as through one man's offense judgment came to all men, resulting in condemnation, even so, through one man's righteous act, the free gift came to all men. So you see the syntactical structure here, even within the sentences. You have Adam was this, so it's mirrored that Christ is the opposite. And this is how the Christians are reading the Bible. And this is how the poets within this Christian context are reading the Bible. For example, this is a portion that I used in a previous lecture, but I think it's a really great example, especially for all of us who read the first 3 chapters of Genesis last week. This is Thomas Goodwin, a English Puritan writer, describing that mirroring process between the old Adam and the new Adam in Christ. Adam's fall, you know, was in a garden. Satan there encountered him and overcame him, led him and all mankind into captivity to sin and death. God now singled out the place where the great Redeemer of the world, the second Adam, should first encounter with his Father's wrath, to be in a garden, and that there he should be bound and led away captive, as Adam was. Pause there. He's talking about Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's betrayed and led off to the crucifixion. By the way, the cross is its own type of tree that mirrors the tree of transgression. Because by a temptation let in at the ear man was condemned, therefore by hearing the word men shall be saved. Serpent tempted with words, it was heard, they acted on it. The same function is being reversed through the redemptive process of hearing the word. Here's the curse, thou shalt eat thy bread in the sweat of thy brows. That was part of Adam's curse. Christ sweat drops of blood for this. It was the force of that curse that caused it. The ground shall bring forth thorns to thee. What did Christ wear on his head at the crucifixion? The crown of thorns. So he's wearing the curse. And this is how the imagery answers and echoes back and forth. Adam in his disobedience was acted in a garden, and Christ both his active and passive obedience also, much of it was in a garden. And at the last, the first beginning of his humiliation was in a garden, so the last step was too, and he was buried, though not in this, yet in another garden. Thus the type and the thing typified answer one another. There's that dialogue process going on between the Old and New Testaments. This is really interesting because this is how this informs. You read a lot of John Donne's religious poetry and you see so much typological imagery going on there. Now, somebody in our community conversation this past week, Michael, asked a really good question. How does type differ from prophecy? And for that matter, how does it differ from symbol and allegory? So let me answer that before we continue. A symbol is something abstract or transcendent, um, a general representation of an idea, while a type has a historical future fulfillment. Okay, so a lot of Christians will wear a cross as the symbol of salvation, a symbol of their suffering with Christ. That's a symbol. Larger idea represented there in this figure. But a type is like the ram caught in the thicket that we read about this week, the one that provided the substitution for Isaac's sacrifice. That ram is a type of Christ's sacrifice. So that's the way Christians have been reading this very old story. That's the difference from symbol and type. Now, allegory is a narrative that has two levels. It's got the literal and the figurative, and each element of it represents some abstract idea. So you can see an allegory contains symbols, but it's a narrative. So we read Plato's Allegory of the Cave in my other course, The Poetics of Enchantment. There are the two layers. There's the literal journey of the prisoner leaving the cave, and then there's the figurative narrative, which is really the philosopher's journey to enlightenment. That's allegory. Now, prophecy differs partly in mode here. Prophecy is verbal, it's a written or a spoken prediction about the future, while a type foreshadows through an image. So one is verbal, the other is largely imagistic, much the way a symbol works. So an example would be Isaiah 53. That's the Hebrew prophet from the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, talks about the suffering servant who prophesies Christ, who will come and suffer. That's a prophecy. Now, a type would be Jonah, who was swallowed by the fish and spent 3 days in the fish's belly. Christ in the New Testament Gospel of Matthew says that that typifies me and my time that I'm going to spend in the tomb. 3 days Jonah spent in the fish, that foreshadows my 3 days I'll spend in the tomb. And it also foreshadows the resurrection. So hopefully that gives you some clarification as to how types differ from other tropes and modes of writing and speaking. Now, we read the story of Abraham and Isaac from Genesis 21 to 23. And we also read of Jacob's encounter with Esau, which I won't spend much time in on the lecture. But how would the typological imagination read these stories? How would somebody who's used to thinking in terms of types read that story of Abraham and Isaac, sacrifice of Isaac? So this is the story. We've read it, the story of Abraham and Isaac going up on Mount Moriah. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as a burnt offering. As they're going up the mountain, Isaac asks, "Where's the sacrifice?" And Abraham says, "God will provide it." In obedience, when they get to the top, they build the altar. Abraham takes Isaac, binds his son, lifts up the knife to slay Isaac, and the angel of the Lord stops him. Says that your faith has been proven. Do no harm to the boy. And there's a ram caught in the thicket that's provided as the substitute for the sacrifice. So here you see the angel, very interestingly, pointing to the ram over here on the right side. Yeah, it's just a striking image, especially the expression on Isaac's face, captured here in the moment. How did Christians read this? It's partly what's important. So we read a little bit, I explained a little bit of Adam as the type, Jesus as the antitype. What is the antitype here? And according to Matthew Henry, this is what he says. And by the way, Matthew Henry was a dissenting minister, born in 1662, lived to 1714, and he's a pretty good representative of what the English Protestants would have thought about the Bible. He writes a brilliant commentary on basically every verse in Scripture, and they started out as lessons for his family in family worship. Each night he would write, a little lesson out, and he just went through the whole Bible like this. So, in the 18th century, a lot of Christians would have a copy of Matthew Henry alongside their King James. This is what Matthew Henry says on this passage about the ram. Henry says, Christ was sacrificed in our stead as this ram instead of Isaac, and his death was our discharge. Here I am, said he, let these go their way. Secondly, though that blessed seed was lately promised, and now typified by Isaac, yet the offering of him up should be suspended till the latter end of the world. Isaac, by the way, is Jesus' ancestor, and ancestor of the Hebrews, as is Abraham. And in the meantime, the sacrifice of beasts should be accepted as this ram was, as a pledge of that expiation, which should one day be made by that great sacrifice. So he's saying, okay, until Jesus is sacrificed, the one seed who is promised to Eve, until he comes and makes an end of sacrifices, there will be a sacrifice of beasts, which typify that. And it's observable that the temple, the place of sacrifice, was afterwards built upon Mount Moriah, and Mount Calvary, where Christ was crucified, was not far off. And John Donne has a poem about this in which he speculates that Mount Moriah was in the same place as Calvary, thus making that mirror image there. There's something very reflective about the way this works. So there we have it. Good example of typological thinking. Now what's done with this is really interesting. What's done with it, with typological reading by preachers, by poets, by readers, is very, very interesting. And one of the things they do is they make natural objects in nature, types. Jonathan Edwards, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, does this really well. He's not the first to do it. Biblical typology, applied to nature, sees natural objects as types that foreshadow often Christ, in this case Christ, or other times spiritual realities. That's the third one. So Jonathan Edwards is a key figure in this tradition. Edwards was an American preacher. He was a huge figure of the Great Awakening in America. He was born in 1703 in Connecticut, and he died in Princeton, New Jersey, in 1758. Really key figure for Reformed theology in America. And he's also really representative of the Reformed tradition in England. And by Reformed, I mean the particularly Protestant Calvinist tradition. What Edwards did was he combined this very robust Protestant theology that he inherited from English writers from the 16th century, and he combined it with Enlightenment thought. Enlightenment was the movement of intellectual thought in the 18th century during the time Edwards was alive and writing. In our course last year, in our community course on American poetry, we read a portion of Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which really exemplified his revivalist preaching. But this poet, well, really this theologian, Jonathan Edwards, developed a systematic way of applying typology, to nature. He sees history and nature as divinely structured, as pointing to Christ, and this is sometimes really amusing. This differs from mere symbolism, as we're about to see. These natural objects are not just metaphors, but they're real, created signs that exist within God's providential design. So we have meaning in both literal history and reality. So here's an example from his work, Images of Divine Things, which really uh, explain this. This is just one of his applications. Roses grow on briars, which is to signify that all temporal sweets are mixed with bitter. But what seems more especially to be meant by it is that true happiness, the crown of glory, is to be come at in no other way than by bearing Christ's cross, by a life of mortification, self-denial, and labor, and bearing all things for Christ. I think what's so striking about this is that he says what's meant by the fact that roses grow on thorns, roses and briars. He says what's meant by this physical truth is that true happiness is not to be attained except through bearing Christ's cross. The rose, the chief of all flowers, is the last thing that comes out. The briary, prickly bush grows before, but the end and crown of all is the beautiful and fragrant rose. You have to imagine what kind of imagination would think of that when they're looking at a rose bush, one deeply steeped, apparently, in the Bible and the method of reading the Bible. So this is part of the evolution of typological thought. You had the book of the Bible and you had the book of nature. And the Protestants, particularly the Protestants, this is in Catholic thought as well, in the allegorical interpretations of Scripture. But it's mainly a Protestant thing that happens in England. This idea that the book of the Bible provides a way of reading the book of nature. The supernatural revelation of Scripture becomes a template for reading the natural revelation. This is what the English Calvinists in the Westminster Confession called the special and the general revelation. Special being the Bible, the general meaning nature. Now, okay, so it's being applied to nature now. The third way is to see it, okay, so here we have an example of Jonathan Edwards applying the rose bush to truths about Christ. Now let's see the third type, which is the natural object as signifying not Christ specifically, but a spiritual truth. And there's one great Puritan, John Flavel, who does this. He has a book called Husbandry Spiritualized. It was published in 1674. It's an astonishing read because it's written towards farmers. Husbandry, by the way, was the word for farming or agricultural. So this man, this Presbyterian minister, John Flavel, has a congregation of farmers and sometimes sailors. And so he writes a book for them in which he describes how things on the farm and things in nature will always point back to spiritual truths. And he wanted them to be able to go about their days, able to read the book of nature. And this is what he says in the preface of his book. As man is compounded of a fleshly and spiritual substance, so God hath endowed the creatures with a spiritual as well as fleshly usefulness. They have not only a natural use in elemental and physical respects, but also a spiritual use, as they bear the figures and similitudes of many sublime and heavenly mysteries. Believe me, saith contemplative Bernard, that's the Saint Bernard of Dante as well, thou shalt find more in the woods than in a corner. Stones and trees will teach thee what thou shalt not hear from learned doctors. And then he begins to quote a Puritan of his own, nearer his own day, Richard Baxter. By a skillful and industrious improvement of the creatures, saith Mr. Baxter, excellently, we might have a fuller taste of Christ in heaven. In every bit of bread we eat, and in every draught of beer we drink, than most men have in the use of the sacrament. I know Baxter's kind of a strange Puritan, but this is one of his more radical views. This is partly what sets him apart, I think. He's saying that in every bit of bread, in the mundanity, the mundaneness of life, it can be transformed through this use, this spiritual function of the brain to interpret things of the natural world in light of the spiritual. So that's the third type, how this gets into daily life. You can't really call this secularization yet, but this is the sort of thinking that the minds are doing, right? The minds writing poetry are doing. Jonathan Edwards has a really funny image in his the image Images of Divine Things, which is his book on typology. I think you can access it for free from the Yale website. I'll provide a link to that in the description if I can find it. He he at one point describes the stillness of a lake as uh, representing the deception of sin. Uh, Very beautiful scene he takes and transforms it into something quite scary, actually. It says, deep beneath that calm surface are dark waters ready to swallow you up. So sometimes it can get very, how did you get there from this image? But it's very amusing, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just a different way of seeing the world, right? So the fourth use of typology, I think, is something that is functionally secularized and reappropriated. And this, I think, is what Dickinson does really interestingly, because Dickinson exists within the same reformed theological framework that Jonathan Edwards and really all of the English Puritans that we have read so far in this lecture, she's a part of that. She absorbs it. What she does with it is different. So I want to read this poem that I assigned. It's a beautiful poem, and it's an answer to an age-old question that has puzzled many of us and many philosophers for many years, and that's the question, why should we find beautiful things beautiful? It's a theory of aesthetics here, aesthetics being concerned with beauty. Why are beautiful things beautiful? And here's the poem from Johnson's edition number 81. We should not mind so small a flower, except it quiet bring our little garden that we lost back to the lawn again. So spicy her carnations nod, so drunken reel her bees, so silver steal 100 flutes from out 100 trees, that whoso sees this little flower by faith may clear behold the bobolinks around the throne and dandelions gold. She says here, starting with the first line, we shouldn't pay attention, we shouldn't mind so tiny a flower unless it quietly brings back our little garden that we lost. We wouldn't pay it any mind, but something about it catches our attention, she says. It quiet bring our little garden that we lost. What's the garden? The Garden of Eden, of course. We read this last week. Beauty is here explained not by, well, yeah, it's explained by an object's spiritual significance to us. The flower is beautiful because it brings back the lost Eden. This little flower becomes a microcosm of the whole Eden that was lost and brings back the lawn again. I love that. And then here at the end, that whoso sees this little flower by faith may clear behold the bobolinks around the throne and dandelions of gold. Again, she's speaking of the garden in the same way that many of the Hebrew poets and prophets spoke about the throne room of God. And this is different from what Edwards was doing. This is different from what Flavel was doing. She doesn't prioritize the spiritual interpretation over the material. She does not say that the material is valuable only for its use, to use Flavel's word, of pointing us to the spiritual. She's saying actually that the spiritual inhabits the material. Eden inhabits the flower in some strange visionary way. It transforms seeing a flower into a beatific vision. Her visionary poetics are founded on this typological reading of the natural world. Jonathan Edwards' typological readings are brilliant. They're very intellectual. Oh, this equals that. It's very allegorical, one-to-one relationship. The rose equals the spiritual and the light. The thorn equals the trials. And there's nothing wrong with that. But no, she goes deeper and she transforms the type into a symbol of an actual aesthetic encounter. It's actually very similar to Coleridge's concept of the symbol that he lays out in his lay sermon, the Statesman's Manual, where he says that the symbols are consubstantial with the truths of which they are conductors. So it's not that the truth lives on this level of an allegory and that the literal and the material is down here. No, it's actually that they're both there. I have a book I want to recommend, which offers some beautiful readings on not just this poem that we read just now, but on several other poems of Dickinson. And it's called Knowing, Seeing, Being by Jennifer L. Leader. And she considers Jonathan Edwards, Emily Dickinson, Marion Moore within this broader American typological tradition. I found it quite affordable on Abe Books. I got it for like $15, which is rare for a monograph of this kind. But here's what she says about the poem that we just read. The typic flower, instead of serving as a conventional spring emblem of the transcendent resurrection, indicates here its typological fulfillment in a horizontal ability to bring our little garden that we lost back to the lawn again. As dynamically interrelational as Jonathan Edwards' Little White Flower in his personal narrative, the flower indicates the once and future garden that will be its completion, both physically and discursively within the meaning of the poem itself. While the garden, evoked in all its sensual detail in the poem's second stanza, is both the telos of the flower and the affirmation of its materiality. This is it's it's a beautiful commentary on that. She means telos here, meaning the end or the purpose of the flower. So this is an academic way. She says it beautifully, but it's another way to say this is instead of adhering to traditional biblical narratives where the Old Testament events figure Christ or salvation, Dickinson applies typology to everyday objects and natural phenomena. She uses birds, flowers, seasons to signify spiritual and even emotional truths. So the natural cycles are shown to be types hinted at an immanent divinity, which I think for her is also transcendent. Immanent means within the physical, that God is within the physical. Transcendent means that God is somewhere out there above the physical. I don't think Dickinson's God is exclusively immanent. I think it's both immanent and transcendent. It operates on those themes, on those planes there. So in other poems like Further in Summer Than the Birds, she presents the cricket song as a way to point forward to the future repose, which is all within that typological structure. And Leader discusses this in the book. I'd love for somebody to do a book on the English typological tradition, because the American Puritans get a lot of coverage in the academic circles, but the English Puritans don't. And I suppose that makes sense, but this is where the Americans got this from, these English Puritans as well. And the English poets are engaging with it just as much as the American poets are. Now, In our last few minutes, we come to the uh, fifth way that the type can be applied, and that's to a secular or contemporary circumstance. And we read Wilfred Owen's The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, which is clearly about World War One. Owen, here he is, British poet and soldier, known for his anti-war poetry. He was born in 1893. He became a teacher and then enlisted in the army. And his experience in the army, in the trenches of the First World War, really shaped his poetry. His poetry will expose the horror of war and challenge the romanticization of war and these notions of the glories on the battlefield. It's not like that in the trenches, he's saying. So what we get is this remarkable poem here. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him, and a knife. And as they sojourned, both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake, and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold the ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. This, of course, I won't have to do a close reading, I think, of this. It's not a commentary upon the Bible story that we read this week. It's an application of a typological event, an event that's rich with typological imagery applied to a current situation, a political situation. The poem twists typology into irony. Instead of a faithful sacrifice leading to a divine fulfillment and mercy, the old men who are in charge of the war would rather turn to senseless massacre than sacrifice their own pride. That's what Owen's saying here. Exposes the false righteousness of those who send young men to die. So if all of this about the typology, it might be a little confusing. It might make your head spin. You're not alone. In writing this lecture, I found it complex myself and difficult to divide. I've listed 4 types of typological engagement, but I think there are several more to be found here. But I think this will become clear for you. Hopefully, you're able to pick up some things from this. I think that you can take forward, and we'll be calling back to it in the future lectures. So this is the typological imagination, extending beyond the strict theological frameworks and moving into more generally secular, spiritual, metaphysical explorations between the self and the natural world, and also the self in the written text.